Unlike the cocky young riders who typically passed through, this one moved with an unnaturally fluid grace, his worn leather gloves resting casually near twin revolvers that seemed strangely out of place on his slender frame. His boyish features masked eyes that held the calculating depth of a seasoned gunslinger, watching every shadow of the bustling mining town with deadly precision. In Rattlesnake Valley, where silver flowed as freely as whiskey, no one suspected this young stranger would soon write his name in legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. Jamie Swift. Cooper hadn't chosen Rattlesnake Valley for any particular reason. It was just another dot on the map in a long journey that had started 5 years ago on his father's ranch in Texas. His simple cotton shirt and trail-worn chaps gave no hint of his true nature, though the peculiar way his gun belts were crossed at his hips might have given a more observant person pause. The silver mining boom had transformed the town from a sleepy waystation into a bustling hub of activity, where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset. The late afternoon air hung heavy with the scent of mineral dust and prosperity. Steam-powered mining equipment cluttered the streets while wagons loaded with ore rumbled past saloons and gambling halls that never seemed to close. The constant rhythm of stamp mills crushing silver ore provided a steady backbeat to the town's daily symphony of commerce and chaos. The sound of his Mustang's hooves on the packed dirt drew curious glances from the townsfolk, most of whom quickly dismissed him as just another young cowpoke looking for work in the mines. Only Madame Chen, whose Golden Palace restaurant served both American and Chinese meals, noticed how the dust didn't seem to cling to him the way it did to others, as if even the desert itself recognized something dangerous in his presence. Jamie guided his horse, a copper-colored Mustang named Quicksilver, past the crowded mining office where prospectors argued over claim boundaries. The animal's movements were as fluid as his own, each step precisely placed, making less noise than seemed natural for a beast of that size. A group of miners fresh from their shift watched him pass, their silver-stained clothes and tired eyes marking them as men who worked the deep shafts where the richest ore was found. The Wells and Hawkins assay office dominated one end of the main street, its iron-barred windows and heavy doors speaking to the wealth that passed through its walls daily. At the other end, the Silver Snake Saloon's gaudy facade promised various forms of entertainment, both legal and otherwise. Between these two poles of legitimate and questionable commerce, the town's residents went about their business, though there was an underlying tension in their movements that spoke of recent troubles. As Jamie rode past the assay office, Sarah Wells emerged from the heavy doors, ledger books clutched to her chest. Unlike the rough-hewn miners and merchants that populated most of the town, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd brought civilization with her to the frontier. Her eyes, sharp as any banker's when assessing ore samples, caught the strange contradiction in the young rider, the boyish face that seemed at odds with his deadly grace. "You looking for work in the mines, boy?" called out Lucas Kane, the burly foreman of the deep silver mine, who was lounging outside the assay office. His tone carried the casual arrogance of someone used to ordering young men around. "We're always hiring strong backs, though you look a mite scrawny for deep shaft work." Jamie's response, when it came, was soft, but clear as mountain water. "Just passing through, sir. Though I appreciate the offer." The words were polite, even deferential, but something in his tone made Kane's confident smile falter slightly. Before the conversation could continue, a commotion erupted from the Silver Snake Saloon. The doors burst open, disgorging 3 members of the notorious Carson gang, their silver-plated revolvers and expensive clothes bought with the proceeds of recent robberies. They dragged a terrified Chinese mine worker between them, accusing him of cheating at cards. The townsfolk quickly cleared the street, their faces showing a familiar fear that spoke of similar incidents in the past. Even Kane, for all his bulk and bluster, suddenly found somewhere else to be. Only Sarah Wells remained, her knuckles white on her ledger books as she watched the scene unfold with poorly concealed anger. Jamie hadn't moved, Quicksilver standing as still as a statue beneath him, His boyish face remained calm, but those who looked closely might have noticed how his gloved hands had shifted slightly, resting closer to the grips of his crossed revolvers. The Carson boys, too focused on their victim, hadn't yet noticed the young stranger who watched them with eyes that had grown cold as mountain ice. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, dust hanging motionless in the late afternoon light, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Madame Chen, standing in the doorway of her restaurant, was perhaps the only one who recognized the deadly stillness that had settled over the young rider. The same stillness she'd seen in legendary gunfighters during her years on the frontier. No one in Rattlesnake Valley knew it yet, but they were about to witness why some called him Swift Cooper, a name whispered in fear by outlaws across 3 territories. By sunset, the Carson gang would learn that youth and innocence can mask the deadliest of skills, and that sometimes the most dangerous men are those you'd least suspect. The Carson gang's rough laughter echoed down the street as they continued tormenting their victim. Buck Carson, the youngest of the 3 brothers but by far the meanest, twisted the mine worker's arm harder. "Maybe we should teach all you Celestials what happens when you try to cheat honest folk," he sneered, his silver-plated revolver catching the sunlight. The eldest Carson, Wade, noticed Sarah Wells's disapproving stare. "Something caught your eye, Miss Wells?" His voice carried the fake politeness of a predator playing with its prey. "Perhaps you'd like to join our little discussion about proper gambling etiquette." His hand brushed the ivory handle of his gun meaningfully. "The only cheating I've seen in this town comes from your family, Mr. Carson," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I have the books to prove it." She clutched her ledger closer, years of careful documentation of the Carson gang's schemes hidden within its pages. Jamie dismounted Quicksilver with fluid grace, each movement precise and controlled. The soft creak of his leather gloves was barely audible as his boots touched the ground. Even now, most observers would have seen nothing more threatening than a young cowboy who didn't know better than to mind his own business. Madame Chen's sharp eyes caught a detail others missed: the way he positioned himself, seemingly casual but providing clear lines of fire that wouldn't endanger any bystanders. She had seen such careful positioning before in Shanghai, when her father's bodyguards prepared for trouble. "Let him go." Jamie's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried clearly in the suddenly quiet street. The words themselves were unremarkable, but there was something in his tone that made Wade Carson's practiced sneer falter slightly. The middle Carson brother, Clay, released his grip on their victim and turned to face Jamie. "Well, look what we got here, boys. Some baby-faced cowpuncher thinking he's grown enough to wear big boys' guns." His hand rested on his own weapon, a Remington revolver with notches carved deep in its handle. The Chinese worker, sensing the shift in attention, quickly scrambled away toward Madame Chen's restaurant. The Carson brothers hardly noticed, too focused on this new source of entertainment. "Those are mighty fine revolvers for such a young fellow," Wade observed, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jamie's crossed gun belts. "Mind telling us where you got them?" "They were my father's," Jamie replied simply. Something in the way he said it, a weight behind the words, made Sarah Wells catch her breath. She'd heard stories, whispered in mining camps and around campfires, about a legendary Texas duelist who'd custom-ordered a pair of matched revolvers with crossed holsters, a man who'd been murdered along with his wife, leaving behind a teenage son who disappeared into the frontier. Buck Carson, never the brightest of the brothers, laughed harshly. "Well, they're wasted on a boy. Maybe we ought to take them off your hands, save you from hurting yourself." He took a step forward, his earlier victim forgotten. Jamie hadn't moved, his stance relaxed but perfectly balanced. "My father always said it's not the guns that matter," he said, his voice still carrying that strange gentleness. "It's the man behind them. He taught me that, along with other things, important things, like how to deal with bullies who prey on those weaker than themselves." Wade Carson's face darkened. The young stranger's calm was getting under his skin in a way mere defiance never could. "You got a big mouth for such a small man. Way I see it, you got 2 choices: hand over them guns and apologize real nice, or we'll make an example of you that'll teach other youngsters to respect their betters, The gathering crowd had pressed back against the buildings, leaving an open space in the street that resembled nothing so much as a dueling ground. The constant rhythm of the stamp mills seemed to fade into the background, as if even the machinery knew something momentous was about to happen. "There's a third choice," Jamie said softly. His boyish features remained calm, but his eyes had changed, becoming hard as agates. "You and your brothers leave town, today, and never come back." The silence that followed his words was absolute. Even the ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Wells found herself gripping her ledger so tight her fingers ached, while Madame Chen whispered something in her native tongue that sounded like a prayer. Clay Carson's face twisted into an ugly grin. "Boys, I think this pup needs to learn what happens when you try to bark at the big dogs." His hand moved toward his gun with the speed that had made the Carson gang infamous in 3 territories. What happened next would be talked about in Rattlesnake Valley for years to come. Later, witnesses would argue about exactly what they'd seen, because it seemed impossible that anyone, let alone a young man, who looked barely old enough to shave, could move that fast. Before Clay's fingers had even closed around his weapon's grip, Jamie's crossed revolvers seemed to materialize in his hands. The movement was so smooth, so precise, it looked almost like a dance. His boyish features hadn't changed, still carrying that same gentle expression. But his eyes, those who saw his eyes in that moment would never forget them. Clay Carson froze, his hand hovering near his gun as he stared into those eyes and finally recognized what they'd all missed. He wasn't looking at some green youth who'd wandered into trouble. He was looking at death itself, wrapped in the deceptive package of youth and innocence. The street held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The legend of Swift Cooper was about to be born in Rattlesnake Valley, though none of them knew it yet. What they did know, with growing certainty, was that nothing in their silver-rich town would ever be quite the same again. The tension in Rattlesnake Valley's main street crackled like lightning before a storm. Clay Carson's hand trembled slightly near his gun, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. His brothers had spread out instinctively, trying to flank the young stranger whose revolvers had appeared in his hands with impossible speed. "Now, son," Wade Carson said, his voice carrying a forced calm that fooled nobody, "let's not do anything hasty. We were just having some fun with that Chinaman. No real harm done." His eyes darted between Jamie's revolvers, noting their unusual make. Custom Colts with elongated barrels and mother-of-pearl grips that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. "Fun." Jamie's soft voice somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Like the fun you had at the Silver Crown mine last month, or the fun at Widow Martinez's ranch?" His boyish face remained calm, but those deadly eyes swept across all 3 brothers. 4 dead miners, a woman left destitute. That kind of fun. Sarah Wells gasped softly. The Silver Crown robbery had been brutal, but no one had been able to prove the Carson gang's involvement. Yet this young stranger spoke of it with absolute certainty. Buck Carson, still not reading the situation properly, barked out a laugh. "You got a big imagination, boy. Ain't nobody proved nothing about Silver Crown." His hand crept closer to his gun. "But dead men can't spread tales, can they?" "Last warning." Jamie's voice dropped even softer. "Leave town. Never return. Or we'll see just how fast you really are." The way he said it, without bravado or threat, just simple certainty, made several onlookers step even further back. Clay Carson's pride finally overcame his instinct for survival. His hand dropped to his gun, and the world seemed to slow down. Those watching would later swear they never saw Jamie move at all. One moment, Clay's fingers were brushing his revolver's grip. The next, there was a crack like summer lightning, and Clay's gun went spinning through the air, along with a significant piece of his holster. Before the first gun had hit the dirt, 2 more shots rang out almost as one. Buck and Wade Carson found themselves suddenly disarmed, their weapons torn from their hands with surgical precision. Not a drop of blood had been spilled, but the message was unmistakable. "That's impossible," Wade breathed, staring at his empty holster. "Nobody's that fast, nobody." His face had gone pale as he finally recognized the crossed draw style, a technique made famous by only one man, the legendary Texas duelist John Lightning Cooper. My father was, Jamie said quietly, his gun still trained on the brothers with rock-steady hands. He could shoot the flame off a candle at 20 paces without disturbing the wick, won the Texas Fast Draw Championship 3 years running. His voice took on an edge of steel. Then your boss, Raymond King Carson, decided he wanted those titles for himself. Didn't work out too well in a fair fight, did it? The gathered crowd murmured at this revelation. Everyone knew about King Carson, the notorious outlaw who'd built a criminal empire across 3 territories. Rumors said he'd once been a legitimate businessman and championship shooter before turning to crime, but few knew the details of his fall from grace. "You're lying," Buck snarled, though his voice shook. "You can't be Cooper's boy. That whole family died in that fire 5 years ago." Fire. Jamie's gentle voice carried an Arctic chill. "Is that what your uncle told you? That coward couldn't face my father man to man, so he sent hired guns in the night. But they made a mistake." For the first time, real emotion cracked through his calm facade. "They left me alive." Sarah Wells watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. The ledgers she carried didn't just document the Carson gang's recent crimes. They held years of evidence, including transactions from the time of the Cooper family murder. Evidence that could prove it wasn't just a tragic accident. Madam Chen had moved closer to Jamie, her shrewd eyes taking in every detail. "Ah," she said softly in her accented English. "Now I understand. You carry yourself like old friend I knew in Shanghai, man who studied art of waiting, patient hunter who tracks prey across many miles." Wade Carson, the smartest of the brothers, had been putting the pieces together. 5 years, he said slowly. 5 years of training, tracking, learning our operations. You're not just passing through, are you? You've been hunting us, working your way up the chain to King Carson himself. Smart man, Jamie acknowledged, his revolvers never wavering. Smarter than your uncle. He thought he'd ended the Cooper line that night. Instead, he just created something new. His boyish features took on an expression that made him suddenly look much older. "My father taught me speed. Your uncle's actions taught me patience." A horse whinnied nervously somewhere down the street, breaking the tension. Jamie's next words came out clear and cold as mountain water. "You have 1 hour to get out of Rattlesnake Valley. Take a message to your uncle. Tell him Swift Cooper sends his regards and I'm coming for him. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, when he least expects it." Clay Carson, finally finding his voice, spat in the dust. "You think you can threaten us? King Carson has an army. He owns judges, marshals, whole towns." Jamie's small smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't need an army, just time and patience. 2 things your uncle gave me plenty of when he murdered my parents." His revolvers disappeared back into their holsters with the same fluid grace they'd appeared. 1 hour, gentlemen. After that, our next meeting won't end with just damaged equipment." The Carson brothers, thoroughly shaken, began backing away. But Wade, ever the tactician, had one last card to play. "This ain't over, boy. King Carson doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Should have stayed dead with your folks." "No," Jamie agreed softly, that deadly stillness settling over him again. "It's not over. But it will be. One Carson at a time." As the brothers slunk away to gather their men, the townsfolk of Rattlesnake Valley looked at the young man in their midst with new eyes. The boyish facade had cracked, revealing something much more dangerous beneath. A hunter who'd spent years preparing for this moment, whose patient pursuit of justice was only just beginning. Sarah Wells stepped forward, her ledgers clutched tight. "Mr. Cooper," she said softly, "I think we need to talk. These books, they contain information about your family's murder, and about a lot more besides." Jamie turned those ancient eyes in a young face toward her, and for the first time since arriving in Rattlesnake Valley, he showed genuine surprise. The game was changing, and everyone could feel it. The legend of Swift Cooper was about to grow in ways none of them could predict. As the dust settled in Rattlesnake Valley's main street, Jamie Swift Cooper followed Sarah Wells into the sturdy brick building that housed the Wells and Hawkins assay office. The evening sun streamed through the iron-barred windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like tiny flecks of gold. Sarah led him past the public counter where miners brought their ore samples, through a heavy oak door into a private office lined with ledgers and mining maps. 5 years I've been gathering evidence, Sarah said, placing her books on a massive desk scarred by the weight of countless ore samples. Not just about the Carson operation, but about everyone connected to it, including what happened to your family's ranch. Her fingers traced the spine of a particular leather-bound volume, its edges worn from frequent handling. Jamie stood near the door, his boyish features composed but alert. Even here, in relative safety, he maintained that deadly readiness that had become a second nature. Why? He asked softly. Why risk crossing men like the Carsons? Sarah's face hardened with remembered pain. Because they killed my father too. Not with guns or fire, but with legal means. Frederick Wells was a county judge in Colorado Territory. He was about to expose King Carson's operation, how they were using legitimate businesses to hide their criminal empire. They destroyed him with false accusations, forged evidence. She pulled out the ledger she'd been touching. But before they forced him off the bench, he taught me to follow the money. And I have, Mr. Cooper. For years. Jamie moved closer, his spurs making no sound on the wooden floor. Madame Chen, who had followed them inside, closed the office door quietly. Her presence seemed natural somehow, as if she too had a part to play in what was unfolding. The fire that killed your parents wasn't random, Sarah continued, opening the ledger to a marked page. King Carson had been losing money, and face, ever since your father beat him in that last championship. But it went deeper than that. Your father had discovered something, hadn't he? Jamie's hand unconsciously touched one of his crossed revolvers, his father's guns. Pa never told me exactly what he'd found. Just that King Carson wasn't just a failed businessman turned outlaw. That his operation went higher up, reached into territorial governments, maybe even Washington. Madame Chen made a soft sound of agreement. Always same story. Evil men wear many masks. Businessman, politician, gentleman. All hide true face. She moved to the window, watching the street with practiced vigilance. Sarah nodded grimly. These books tell the story. Shell companies, borrowed names, bribes disguised as legitimate investments. The Carson Empire isn't just about rob banks and stealing cattle. They're trying to control the whole territory, one town at a time. And Rattlesnake Valley is next, Jamie concluded, his soft voice carrying a note of certainty. All this silver flowing through town, it's not just about stealing it, they want to control it. Use it. Exactly. Sarah pulled out more ledgers, spreading them on the desk. The Carson gang's recent activities, the Silver Crown mine robbery, the attacks on smaller claims, they're not random. They're systematic. They're weakening the independent miners, forcing them to sell out to legitimate companies that are actually Carson fronts. Jamie studied the documents, his young face intent. Despite his deadly skills, in that moment he looked every bit his age. Barely 20, forced to grow up too fast. My father's murder, your father's disgrace. This town's troubles, Mel. It's all connected. A web of corruption spreading across the frontier. Which is why killing King Carson won't be enough, Sarah said quietly. You might get your revenge, Mr. Cooper, but his organization would survive. Someone else would take his place. Unless, Madame Chen interjected, moving away from the window. Young Hunter becomes more than Hunter. Becomes symbol. Hope for those who fear. Terror for those who corrupt. Jamie looked up from the ledgers, meeting Sarah's determined gaze. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Wells? A partnership, she replied firmly. Your skills, my evidence. Together we could do more than just kill King Carson. We could destroy everything he's built, expose everyone involved, bring real justice, not just revenge. For a long moment, Jamie was silent, those old eyes in his young face considering the implications. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but resolute. My father always said revenge is like a snake that bites its own tail. Maybe he was trying to tell me something more important than just how to shoot fast. He was teaching you to be righteous, man, Madame Chen said, approvingly. Fast gun without righteous heart is just another killer. Before Jamie could respond, hoofbeats sounded in the street. Lots of them. Madame Chen moved swiftly to the window. Carson brothers return, she reported grimly. Many riders with them. More than hour you gave them. They were never going to leave, Jamie said, that deadly stillness settling over him again. Wade Carson's too smart for that. He's figured out that this isn't just about them anymore. Sarah quickly gathered the most crucial ledgers. There's a back way out through the assay room. We can take these to the bank vault. No, Jamie interrupted gently. No more running, no more hiding. He checked his father's revolvers with practiced ease. It's time to show King Carson and his whole operation that there's something more dangerous than bullets. The truth. The sound of horses and men filled the street outside. The next chapter in the legend of Swift Cooper was about to begin, and Rattlesnake Valley would never be the same. The evening shadows lengthened across Rattlesnake Valley as Jamie Cooper watched the growing crowd of armed men from the assay office window. He counted at least 20 riders, not including the Carson brothers, hardened gunmen drawn from the outlying camps and hideouts. The sight of so many guns should have been intimidating, but his boyish features remained calm, almost serene. They're trying to surround the building, Sarah observed, her voice steady despite the danger. She'd positioned herself near the heavy oak desk, the crucial ledgers close at hand. Wade Carson's no fool. He knows these books could destroy everything his uncle built. Madame Chen had disappeared briefly and returned with a worn leather satchel. From it, she produced two peculiar objects, a small brass tube with elaborate Chinese engravings, and what appeared to be a packet of red paper. When I left Shanghai, she said, her accented voice carrying a hint of amusement, I bring more than just recipes. Jamie raised an eyebrow, momentarily distracted from the gathering threat outside. You're full of surprises, Madame Chen. Survive long time in dangerous places must have many surprises, she replied with a slight smile. These help create confusion, make 20 men seem less brave. Her experienced hands began preparing whatever devices she'd brought, her movements quick and precise. The sun's dying rays painted the office in shades of amber and gold, glinting off the mother-of-pearl grips of Jamie's revolvers. My father used to say that the most dangerous moment in any fight is when you think you have the advantage, he said softly. Makes you careless, makes you stupid. A voice boomed from the street, Wade Carson's cultured tones carrying clearly through the evening air. Cooper, time for playing games is over. Come out now, you might live to see morning. Sarah moved to Jamie's side, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent she wore, an incongruous touch of civilization in this dusty frontier town. They'll burn the building if they have to, she said quietly. All these ledgers, all this evidence, we can't let them destroy it. No, Jamie agreed, his voice carrying that same gentle certainty that had unnerved the Carson brothers earlier. We won't. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Why did you really keep all these records, Miss Wells? It wasn't just about your father, was it? Sarah's hand unconsciously touched a small locket at her throat. My father believed in the law, Mr. Cooper. Not just the written kind, but the deeper law, the one that says every person has a right to live without fear. When they destroyed him, they didn't just kill a judge. They killed that idea in every town they touched. Her eyes met his, and there was steel beneath their softness. Someone has to show people they can stand up again. Young Miss speaks truth, Madame Chen interjected, still working with her mysterious devices. Same reason I come to America. In China, I see strong men crush weak, say this natural way of world. But is not natural, is choice. We all make choice, to be cruel or kind, to stand or kneel. More riders were arriving in the street, their horses' hooves raising dust in the dying light. Among them was a face Jamie recognized, Professor Thaddeus Grant, King Carson's personal accountant and the man who'd helped create the paper trail that destroyed Judge Wells. The pieces were falling into place. "Your father taught you more than just shooting, didn't he?" Sarah asked softly. "He taught you about justice." Jamie's hand touched one of his revolvers, feeling the familiar grip that had once fit his father's hand. "Pa always said a fast gun wasn't worth much without a straight heart behind it." Took me a while to understand what he meant. His young face took on a thoughtful expression. 5 years of tracking the Carsons, learning their operation. Somewhere along the way, revenge stopped being enough. Madame Chen finished her preparations, the mysterious devices now ready. "Time to choose, young hunter. Kill Carson men tonight, maybe feel better for a moment, but change nothing. Or..." She gestured at the ledgers, at Sarah, at the town beyond the windows. "Or become something more. Become symbol, like honorable judge, like your father, like your..." Before Jamie could respond, a new commotion erupted in the street. Through the window, they could see a group of miners approaching, the same men who'd been watching when Jamie first rode into town. They were armed, not with professional weapons, but with pickaxes and hunting rifles. Leading them was Lucas Kane, the burly mine foreman who'd offered Jamie work just hours ago. "Carson," Kane's voice boomed out, "this ain't your town. These good people trusted me to keep the peace while the sheriff's away, and I aim to do just that." Wade Carson's laugh carried clearly. "Stay out of this, Kane. This is private business between us and young Mr. Cooper. Don't make it your concern. When you brought 20 gunmen into my town, you made it my concern." Kane's response was backed by murmurs of agreement from his miners. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move would turn Rattlesnake Valley's main street into a bloodbath. Jamie watched it all with those ancient eyes in his young face, seeing not just the immediate danger, but the moment of possibility it presented. "Well, Mr. Cooper?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of symbol will you be?" Jamie checked his revolvers one final time, each movement precise and measured. "The kind my father would have been proud of," he said softly. "The kind that shows people they don't have to be afraid anymore." The sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and crimson. In the gathering darkness, Rattlesnake Valley held its breath, waiting to see what kind of legend would be born in its dusty streets. Inside the assay office, Jamie Cooper's mind worked with the same precision that guided his gun hand. The street outside had become a powder keg, Kane's miners facing off against Carson's gunmen, with the town's future hanging in the balance. "Madame Chen," he said softly, never taking his eyes from the window. "What exactly are those devices you brought?" The Chinese restaurateur smiled mysteriously. "In Shanghai, festival makers use similar things. Make smoke, make light, make brave men confused about what real and what shadow." She held up the brass tube. "This one, very special. Create dragon's breath, bright flash, loud noise. That one," she pointed to the red paper packet, "make smoke thick as mountain fog." Sarah was rapidly sorting through her ledgers, organizing them by importance. "The Carson men are spread too thin," she observed. "They're trying to cover too many angles at once." "Pride," Jamie replied, his boyish features thoughtful. "Wade Carson's smart, but he's still making the same mistake they all make, thinking numbers and firepower are enough." He turned to the two women, his young face showing a maturity beyond his years. "I need you both to trust me. What I'm about to propose is going to sound crazy." Madame Chen's eyes twinkled. "Young man who faces 20 gunmen already crazy. Might as well hear plan." Jamie laid out his strategy, speaking in that same soft, measured tone he always used. As he talked, Sarah's eyes widened while Madame Chen nodded approvingly. It was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but it had the advantage of being completely unexpected. Kane's men aren't gunfighters, he explained, but they know every alley and side street in town, every mining shaft, every tunnel. He turned to Sarah. You said the Carson Empire works by making people afraid, so we show them something more powerful than fear. Unity, Sarah breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. The whole town, working together. Exactly. Jamie checked his revolvers one final time. Wade Carson expects me to think like a gunfighter. Instead, we're going to think like miners. Use the whole town as our battlefield. Madame Chen was already dividing her devices into smaller packages. I send message through kitchen. Chinese workers in every business here, laundry, restaurant, mines, they help. They understand fighting tyranny. The plan came together quickly. Sarah would ensure the ledgers were protected, spreading copies among trusted townspeople. Kane's miners would coordinate with Madame Chen's network, using their knowledge of the town's layout to maximum advantage. And Jamie would give Wade Carson exactly what he expected, but not in the way he expected it. Your father would be proud, Sarah said softly, touching Jamie's arm. Not just of your skill, but of this, helping people find their courage. Pa always said a man's real strength isn't in his gun arm, Jamie replied, his voice carrying a hint of remembered pain. It's in his ability to bring out the best in others. He looked down at his crossed revolvers. Took me 5 years to understand he wasn't just teaching me to shoot. He was teaching me to lead. Outside, the tension was building. Wade Carson's voice carried clearly through the evening air. Last chance, Cooper. Surrender now, or we start shooting up this nice little town of yours. Jamie moved to the office door, his movements carrying that deadly fluid grace. Madam Chen, get your people ready. Miss Wells, make sure those ledgers survive no matter what happens. He paused, looking back at them with those old eyes in his young face. What we do tonight isn't just about stopping the Carsons. It's about showing every town in the territory that they don't have to live in fear. Sarah clutched her ledgers tight. Be careful, Mr. Cooper. A symbol isn't much use if it dies in its first showing. A ghost of a smile touched Jamie's lips. My father survived 3 championship duels before Carson's men burned our ranch. He taught me every trick he knew, and I've learned a few more since then. His face grew serious. But more importantly, he taught me that a man who fights only for himself is already beaten. Tonight we fight for something bigger. Madame Chen pressed one of her brass tubes into his hand. When dragon breathes, even bravest gunmen remember he mortal man. Jamie nodded, securing the device in his gun belt. The last rays of daylight were fading, and with them, the last chance for a peaceful resolution. But in the gathering darkness, something new was taking shape. Not just one young man's stand against corruption, but a whole town's awakening to its own strength. Whatever happens, he said softly, remember, the Carson Empire isn't built on guns or money. It's built on fear. Tonight we show them what happens when people stop being afraid. With those words, Jamie Swift Cooper stepped out to face his destiny, not just as a deadly duelist, but as something more, a symbol of hope in a land that desperately needed it. Behind him, Sarah Wells and Madame Chen set the rest of the plan in motion, while all around them, Rattlesnake Valley prepared for a night that would become legend. Wade Carson sat astride his black stallion in the deepening twilight, studying the Wells and Hawkins assay office with cold calculation. Behind him, his gathered gunmen shifted restlessly, their trigger fingers itching for action. The evening wind carried the scent of dust and imminent violence. Professor Grant, Wade called out to the well-dressed accountant who hung back from the main group. You're certain about this boy? About who he really is? Thaddeus Grant pushed his wire-rimmed spectacles up his nose, his scholarly demeanor at odds with the surrounding roughnecks. Quite certain. The timing, the crossed-draw technique, it all fits. More importantly, he lowered his voice, I've sent a telegram to your uncle. King Carson remembers something about that night at the Cooper Ranch, something that's troubled him for years. Clay Carson spat in the dust. What's to be troubled about? We burned the place. End of story. No, Grant replied, his educated tone carrying an edge of concern. According to your uncle, John Cooper said something before he died. Something about evidence he'd hidden, proof of the organization's reach. They searched the ranch, but never found it. Wade's eyes narrowed. And now his son shows up here, where that Wells woman has been keeping her damned ledgers. He turned to his brothers. This isn't just about some fast gun kid looking for revenge. This is about protecting everything Uncle Raymond built, the gathered gunmen murmured amongst themselves. They'd signed on for what they thought would be an easy job. Intimidate a young upstart, maybe rough up some townspeople. Now it was starting to sound like something bigger, more dangerous. 20 men to handle one boy? Buck Carson laughed nervously. Seems like overkill to me. That boy just disarmed all three of us without breaking a sweat, Wade snapped. And now we know he's been planning this for years. He surveyed his men. Spread out. Cover every exit. I want sharpshooters on the roofs of the hotel and the Mercantile. When Cooper makes his move, I want enough lead in the air to turn that office into a sieve. As his men moved to their positions, Wade noticed something odd. The townsfolk weren't running scared like they usually did when the Carson gang flexed its muscle. Instead, there was a purposeful energy in their movements. Kane's miners still held their ground, but others were moving too. Chinese workers slipping through alleyways, shopkeepers conferring in whispers. Something's not right, Professor Grant observed, his academic mind picking up on the pattern. They're organizing, communicating. Doesn't matter, Clay growled. Let them try something. Give us an excuse to really show this town who's in charge. Wade wasn't so sure. 5 years of running operations for his uncle had taught him to recognize the signs of trouble. The boy, Cooper, was too calm, too prepared. This didn't feel like a last stand. It felt like a trap about to be sprung. Uncle Raymond's on his way, Buck announced, returning from the telegraph office. Says he'll be here by midnight with 30 more men. We need to end this before then, Wade decided. Uncle Raymond's not going to be happy we let Cooper live in the first place. And if there really is evidence hidden somewhere, he let the implications hang in the air. Professor Grant cleared his throat. There's something else. Those ledgers the Wells woman keeps, I've seen some of their contents. She's been tracking everything, every transaction, every bribe, every connection. If those books ever reach a federal marshal, then we burn it all, Wade snarled. The office, the ledgers, Cooper, the Wells woman, Sendry Thief, Adam. Everything. Tinter, Beimreitain, sent a message to any other town that thinks about standing up to the Carson Empire. As if in response to his words, the door of the assay office opened. Jamie Cooper stepped out onto the boardwalk, his young face calm in the gathering darkness. The street fell silent, every eye drawn to the slender figure whose crossed revolvers gleamed dully in the last light of day. One last chance, Wade. Cooper's soft voice carried clearly in the stillness. Take your men and leave. Tell your uncle his time's over. The days of people living in fear of the Carson name are done. Wade Carson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. There was something in the boy's voice, not bravado, not anger, but absolute certainty. The same tone John Cooper had used that day at the championship, just before he'd outdrawn Raymond Carson in front of hundreds of witnesses. You're outnumbered, boy, Wade called back, fighting down his unease. Whatever you're planning, it won't work. This isn't some fancy shooting competition. This is about power, real power, the kind that builds empires. No, Cooper replied, still in that same gentle tone. This is about choice. Every person's choice to stand up or kneel down. Your uncle forgot something important when he murdered my parents. He thought fear was the strongest force in the world. Those ancient eyes in that young face swept across the gathered gunmen. He was wrong. As if on cue, lanterns began to light up all along the street, in windows, on porches, in alleyways. Dozens of them, then scores, creating a web of light that revealed just how many townspeople had gathered. Not running, not hiding, but standing their ground. Wade Carson felt the situation slipping away from him. The trap wasn't just about guns or ledgers or evidence. It was about something more dangerous to the Carson empire than any bullet. Hope. "Kill him!" Wade roared, drawing his gun. "Kill them all!" The night exploded into chaos, but not the kind Wade Carson had expected. As his men raised their weapons, the legend of Swift Cooper was about to grow in ways none of them could have predicted. The first shots shattered the evening quiet, but they weren't the synchronized volley Wade Carson had ordered. Instead, chaos erupted from multiple directions as Madame Chen's dragon's breath devices detonated from strategic points around the street. Brilliant flashes and thunderous reports sent horses rearing and gunmen diving for cover. Jamie Cooper moved like liquid lightning. The moment Wade Carson's men opened fire, he was already in motion, his crossed revolvers seeming to materialize in his hands. His first shots weren't aimed to kill. Instead, he targeted the oil lanterns near Carson's sharpshooters on the rooftops. Glass shattered, flames erupted, and the carefully positioned gunmen found themselves silhouetted against the sudden fire. "The roofs!" Wade screamed. "He's picking off the high ground!" But it wasn't just Jamie they had to worry about. Kane's miners had disappeared into the maze of alleyways they knew so well, emerging at unexpected moments to harry Carson's men from multiple angles. Their picks and shovels weren't elegant weapons, but they made fearsome clubs when wielded by men used to breaking rock. Through the growing smoke and confusion, Sarah Wells' voice rang out from somewhere in the chaos. "Show them what Rattlesnake Valley really is. Show them we're not afraid anymore." Madame Chen's smoke devices added to the confusion, creating thick banks of fog that rolled through the street like living things. Carson's men found themselves shooting at shadows while the townspeople, who knew every inch of their home, moved with confidence through the artificial murk. "It's a trap!" Professor Grant shouted, his scholarly composure cracking. "They've turned the whole town into a weapon." Jamie's voice carried through the smoke, still maintaining that deadly, gentle tone. 5 years learning your tactics, Wade. 5 years watching how you operate. You always think bigger is better. More men, more guns, more fear. But you never learned the most important lesson my father taught me. "And what's that?" Wade snarled, firing blindly into the smoke. The answer came as Jamie seemed to materialize out of the haze, his boyish features calm despite the chaos around them. "The fastest draw means nothing if your heart isn't true." Wade's gun swung toward him, but Jamie was already moving. 2 shots rang out, precise, measured, deliberate. Wade's gun went spinning away, along with his brother Clay's backup weapon. Neither man was seriously hurt, but the message was clear. Every shot was exactly where Jamie wanted it to be. "This is impossible," Buck Carson shouted, watching his men falling into disarray. "He's just one boy." "No," Kane's voice boomed from nearby. "He's not alone anymore." The burly mine foreman emerged from the smoke leading a charge of miners, their impromptu weapons driving back a group of Carson's gunmen who had been trying to flank Jamie's position. Madame Chen's network of Chinese workers had also joined the fray, using their intimate knowledge of the town's back alleys and service passages to appear and disappear like ghosts, creating even more confusion among the outlaws. More than one of Carson's men found himself suddenly tangled in wet laundry lines or pelted with kitchen implements from unseen assailants. Professor Grant, attempting to maintain some control over the situation, tried to organize a group to rush the assay office and seize the ledgers. But Sarah Wells had been busy too. Every window they approached seemed to hold a defender, and copies of the incriminating documents had already been distributed to trusted townspeople throughout Rattlesnake Valley. "Your uncle's empire is built on paper and fear," Jamie called out to Wade, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "What happens when people stop being afraid, Wade? What happens when they realize they have the power to stand up?" The answer was unfolding before their eyes. Carson's men, used to terrorizing isolated homesteads or overwhelming small groups, found themselves facing an entire town that had rediscovered its courage. Their superior numbers and firepower meant little in the close confines of streets and alleys where every window might hide a defender, every shadow might conceal a miner's pickaxe. "Fall back," Wade ordered, finally recognizing the trap for what it was. "Regroup at the edge of town. Wait for Uncle Raymond." But Jamie had anticipated this too. As Carson's men tried to retreat, they found their horses had been scattered by strategically placed firecrackers, another of Madame Chen's contributions. Those that remained were hemmed in by overturned wagons and hastily erected barricades. "Your uncle isn't coming," Jamie said softly, appearing once more out of the smoke. "That telegram was intercepted. Right now, federal marshals are closing in on his main camp. All your carefully hidden papers, all your secret accounts, everything Sarah Wells documented in Samutain, it's already on its way to the territorial capital." Wade Carson's face went pale as he realized the full scope of what they'd walked into. This wasn't just about one town or one young gunslinger seeking revenge. This was the carefully planned dismantling of an empire that had taken years to build. The smoke was beginning to clear now, revealing the true state of the battle. Carson's men were scattered, disarmed, or cornered. The townspeople of Rattlesnake Valley stood proud, bloodied but unbowed, finally free of the fear that had held them for so long. And in the middle of it all stood Jamie Cooper, his father's revolvers still held steady, those ancient eyes in his young face watching as the Carson Empire began to crumble, not through superior firepower or faster draws, but through the courage of ordinary people standing together against tyranny. The legend of Swift Cooper was transforming before their eyes, becoming something more than just another tale of frontier justice. It was becoming a symbol of hope for every town that had ever lived under the shadow of fear. Wade Carson stood in the middle of the smoke-filled street, his carefully laid plans in ruins around him. His remaining men had been corralled by Kane's miners and the townspeople, their weapons confiscated. Clay nursed a wounded arm, while Buck simply stared in disbelief at how quickly their overwhelming force had been dismantled. "You're so much like your father," Wade said, his cultured voice carrying a bitter edge. "John Cooper always had to do things the righteous way. Always had to be the hero." His hand strayed toward a hidden derringer in his vest. "Look where it got him. Look where it—" Jamie's response was quiet but carried clearly in the now hushed street. "My father died standing for what he believed in. Your uncle killed him because he was afraid, not of his gun, but of his integrity." Those old eyes in the young face never wavered. "Just like you're afraid now." Professor Grant, seeing the tide had turned, tried to slip away in the confusion. He made it 3 steps before Madame Chen's wooden spoon cracked across the back of his head with surprising force. "Educated man should know better," she said firmly, collecting his dropped briefcase. "Always more papers inside, yes?" Sarah Wells emerged from the assay office, additional ledgers in hand. "These date back 10 years, she announced. "Every transaction, every bribe, every murder disguised as an accident, including," she fixed Wade with a steely gaze, "detailed accounts of what really happened at the Cooper Ranch." "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Wade snarled. "The Carson Empire isn't just about Uncle Raymond. We have judges in our pocket, politicians on our payroll. You think a few ledgers and a fast gun boy can bring all that down?" "No," Jamie replied softly. "But the truth can. That's what my father discovered, isn't it? Not just evidence of your local operations, but proof of how far the corruption reached." His boyish features hardened slightly. "That's why your uncle didn't just kill him. You had to burn everything trying to destroy whatever evidence he'd found." Wade's face twisted. "Uncle Raymond should have killed you too. Should have made sure the Cooper line ended that night. But he didn't." Jamie's voice remained steady. "And in sparing me, he gave me something more dangerous than revenge. He gave me purpose." He gestured at the townspeople around them. "Look around, Wade. Look what happens when people stop being afraid. When they remember, they have the power to stand up." Kane stepped forward, his massive frame imposing even without a weapon. "The boy's right. Every town you've terrorized, every place you've tried to control through fear, They're all going to hear about tonight, about how Rattlesnake Valley stood up. Wade's hand inched closer to his hidden derringer. You really think it's going to be that easy? That one night in one town changes everything? No, Jamie acknowledged. Change is never easy. But it starts with a choice. The choice to stand up instead of kneeling down. His eyes tracked Wade's subtle movement. Like the choice you're about to make. The tension stretched like a drawn wire. Everyone could sense what was coming. Wade Carson's last desperate play. The hidden derringer, a final attempt to snatch victory from defeat, or at least take his father's killer with him. You know what your father's last words were? Wade asked, malice dripping from every word. He begged Uncle Raymond to spare your mother, offered to sign everything over to us. Some hero. But Jamie didn't take the bait. My father taught me that a man's last words don't matter nearly as much as how he lived his life, and he lived his standing for what was right. Those ancient eyes showed a glimmer of sadness. I'd rather die like him than live like you. Wade's hand flashed toward his vest, the derringer appearing like a silver snake. But Jamie Cooper hadn't spent 5 years training for nothing. Before Wade's finger could find the trigger, 2 shots rang out almost as one. The derringer went spinning away along with Wade's belt buckle, a display of precision that left no doubt about who truly controlled the situation. That's twice I've let you draw on me, Jamie said softly. There won't be a third time. Wade Carson fell to his knees, not from pain. Jamie's shots had deliberately avoided causing serious injury, but from the sudden, crushing realization of complete defeat. The Carson Empire, built on fear and corruption, had been undone not just by a faster gun but by the courage of common people standing together. Sarah Wells stepped forward, her ledgers clutched tight. The federal marshals will be here by morning. Everything your uncle built, all the corruption and fear, it ends tonight. As if to emphasize her words, more lanterns were being lit all around town, pushing back the darkness, driving away the shadows where fear had once lurked. The people of Rattlesnake Valley moved with new confidence, standing tall, meeting each other's eyes with pride instead of fear. Jamie Cooper holstered his father's revolvers with that same fluid grace, but now there was something different in his bearing. Not just the deadly skill of a gunfighter, but the quiet dignity of someone who had found his true purpose. The legend of Swift Cooper was changing, becoming something more than just another tale of frontier justice. It was becoming a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people could find the courage to stand together against tyranny. And in Rattlesnake Valley, as the last traces of gun smoke drifted away on the evening breeze, a new day was already beginning to dawn. 3 months after the night that became known as the Stand at Rattlesnake Valley, the town had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The Wells and Hawkins Assay Office had become more than just a place to evaluate ore. It was now the heart of a growing movement for justice across the territory. Jamie Cooper stood on the boardwalk outside, watching the morning bustle with those same old eyes in his young face, though now they carried something new. Hope. His father's revolvers still rode in their crossed holsters, but they were no longer the tools of vengeance they had once been. Another letter from Silver City, Sarah Wells said, emerging from the office with a fresh stack of correspondence. They've driven out the last of King Carson's men. Your reputation seems to be spreading, Mr. Cooper. Our reputation, Jamie corrected softly. He turned to face her, noting how the morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair. None of this would have happened without your ledgers, your courage. King Raymond Carson's empire had crumbled faster than anyone expected once the evidence was exposed. Federal marshals had found him trying to flee across the Mexican border, his network of corruption unraveling as judges and politicians scrambled to save themselves. The Carson name, once whispered in fear, was now spoken with contempt. Madame Chen emerged from her restaurant, which had become a gathering place for people working to rebuild their communities. Young man finally learned most important lesson, she said with satisfaction. Fast gun good for fighting, but strong heart better for leading. Kane and his miners had established a cooperative that ensured fair treatment for workers throughout the region. The Chinese workers, led by Madame Chen, had gained new respect in the community. Even Professor Grant, after serving his sentence, had begun helping to expose similar corruption in other territories. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said quietly, standing close enough that Jamie could smell her familiar lavender scent. "Not just of how you've honored his memory, but of what you've built here." Jamie touched one of his revolvers, feeling the smooth pearl grip that had once fit his father's hand. "Pa used to say that a man's legacy isn't measured in notches on his gun, but in the lives he touches." He smiled slightly. "Took me 5 years of hunting the Carsons to understand what he really meant." The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A young rider came galloping up the street, pulling up in front of them with a mix of excitement and awe on his face. "Mr. Cooper, Miss Wells. There's trouble in Dead Horse Junction. Some of Blackwood's gang trying to set up like the Carsons did here." Instead of tension, Jamie felt a quiet certainty settle over him. This was what his father had been preparing him for, not just to be fast with a gun, but to help people find their own strength. "Well, Miss Wells," he asked, turning to Sarah, "shall we show another town how to stand up?" Sarah was already heading inside to collect her ledgers. "I'll get my horse." She paused at the door, looking back at him with a mixture of affection and determination. "You know, Mr. Cooper, for someone who came here looking for revenge, you found something much more valuable." "A purpose," he agreed softly. Then, with a hint of that boyish charm that sometimes broke through his serious demeanor, he added, "And please, after everything we've been through, I think you can call me Jamie." Madame Chen watched them with knowing eyes. "Love story always better than revenge story," she said sagely. "Last longer, too." As they prepared to ride out, Jamie looked back at Rattlesnake Valley, at the town that had helped him transform from a vengeful son into something more. The legend of Swift Cooper had evolved beyond tales of his lightning-fast draw. Now it was a story of hope, of courage, of people standing together against tyranny. His father's final lesson had finally become clear. True justice wasn't found at the end of a gun, but in the hearts of people willing to stand up for what was right. The young boy who had spent 5 years training to be the fastest gun in the territory had become something far more important, a symbol that reminded people they didn't have to live in fear. "Coming, Mr. Cooper?" Sarah called, already mounted and ready to ride. Jamie checked his revolvers one last time, not as weapons of vengeance now, but as tools in service of justice. "Just thinking about what Pa used to say," he replied, swinging into his saddle. "A man's true speed isn't measured by how fast he can draw, but by how quickly he can turn strangers into friends." As they rode out together, the morning sun at their backs, the legend of Swift Cooper was still growing. But now it wasn't just about a young man with faster hands than any gunslinger in the West. It was about something bigger. The story of how one person's stand for justice could help others find their own courage to stand tall. The sound of their horses' hooves faded into the distance as Rattlesnake Valley watched its heroes ride out to help another town find its strength. And somewhere, Jamie liked to think, his father was watching too, finally at peace knowing that his son had found a way to be both fast and just, both deadly and kind. A protector rather than just a gunfighter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any uploads from us.